Welcome to Sumbits, where we decode the PowerSchool development experience. Sumbits is brought to you by MBA. Let's start the show.
Welcome back, everybody. This is part 2 to our wonderful episode of This or That with Adam Larsen. If you missed the last episode, we're talking about what we use in our development. This or that. In the first episode, we talked about CPM versus Blue Steel. We talked about a little bit about browser options, Chrome or Firefox. And we started talking about text editors. I think we pretty much left up last episode talking about what text editors we currently use. And before we really start defending those stances, I'm still drinking Old Tub. Pretty sure Eric is still drinking Busch Latte.
Well, I switched over to Lot 40, which I gave a good description to a while back. So we'll just
You did.
I'll just say I'm drinking it now.
With that, Adam's still drinking the root beer.
I finished the root beer and I've switched to just water and a Yeti at this point. It's very boring, but that's where I am. I'm hydrating.
Fair enough.
We love you anyway.
Well, for other reasons,
here, friends.
Definitely nice to have you back, Adam. I guess still, even though most people had to wait a couple weeks to hear the second parter. But let's dive right back into it. Kind of reiterating back to the text editors that we use. Ryan, you're a brackets guy for the most part. Use a couple other tools depending on the use case. Adam, you're a VS Code guy.
Yeah, VS Code.
You claim that you're going to convert everybody if you just showed it. Eric, as am I, are a Sublime users. We did kind of cut off Eric a little bit. You started talking about kind of whatever text editor you use it well, right?
Yeah.
One thing that I do want to kind of bring up that Sublime has that really made me start using Sublime was the those shortcuts that you had created.
Yeah, and you can do those things with other text editors too, I believe. It's how they're implemented and some of the, what you get used to. And now that I've been using Sublime for years, I'm used to it gets to be muscle memory, right? Like it's a keystroke thing. I don't even think about the fact that I'm hitting Control Shift up arrow, down arrow, or Control F2 to put a bookmark somewhere. Or Control D, I double click, I highlight, I hit Control D. That automatically says where's the next occurrence of whatever you just highlighted, and automatically moves to that. It'll highlight that. And then another really powerful thing with text editors is multi-line editing, and most intelligent text editors can do that, right?
Sure.
So when I named this variable very poorly. I just I double click on that variable name and I hit Control D until it stops highlighting the next one, and I retype the name, and that's going to change it on line 555 and 1025 simultaneously. Other intelligent text editors can do that kind of stuff too. I just really think what you talked about, the shortcuts, right? And so these shortcuts I programmed with JSON, which is not very user-friendly, but if you're a full-time developer, it's not that big of a deal. But the fact of the matter is, it's like, I don't want to have to type this over and over again. I type in PS Tlist, I hit Control Space on my keyboard, and it drops in the template for Tlist SQL for me. Honestly, if I had to write Tlist SQL from memory without my text editor, I don't know if I could do it. And I do it every day.
Now you know why it's built into SQL Studio as one of the export types. I don't want to type it either.
So there's my pitch for Sublime Text and my pitch for, regardless of what text editor you're using, learn how to use it properly. Just go out to YouTube and go. I've done it before. Best practices, best tips for using text editor X. So anyway, that said. I'd like to know from Adam and from Ryan, I guess,
if you gotta.
why your text editors? What do they do? What features do they have that made them your editor of choice?
I want to you know what? There's one thing you said that I really liked, and it really kind of
just one. I mean, everything I say is gold. Let me just go ahead and throw that out there.
But it melds with the PowerSchool kind of sentimentality here. And it's the features, right? And both Sublime and Brackets have the availability to install plugins, right? To do different things. And there's the compare. One thing that comes to mind with there's the Beautify and there's compare with Brackets that I use quite frequently. Like Beautify, awesome. Like, right? Like you can just write as sloppy code as you want, and then you just Control-Shift-B, and then you don't have to worry about all your indents and your tabs, whatever. It just does it for you. And I assume Sublime has the same thing. And it's learning to know how to use them, but also just making sure that
wouldn't know that he writes pretty code anyway.
making sure.
I wasn't going to say it. Thank you, Sean, for throwing that out there. I didn't want to toot my own horn. As we all know, humility is my best quality.
Well, but honestly, also because when it comes to PowerSchool code, sometimes you can't rely on that Beautify, because when you start melding T-lists, those square brackets start screwing over your shit, stuff all around. Either way,
Ryan,
let's just restart that. Sometimes you get Beautify when you got T-lists mixed in with your everything else. It'll all of a sudden take those square brackets and then put extra spaces, and now you're sitting there. Okay, sure, Beautify all my HTML and all my JavaScript, but now anything that came after that square bracket, now there's an extra line in a tab. Now I got to backspace all that.
Well, I think that's worth mentioning is, we've talked about in previous episodes that, one of the greatest things about where PowerSchool has gone is using web standards, right? So when we're talking about using text editors, these text editors are built around using basic web standards, and PowerSchool doesn't always fall within that. So that's part of why I wanted to have this conversation and see where you guys are defending the tools that you're using is, there's caveats to PowerSchool and caveats to PowerSchool code that aren't normal web standards, and which one of these text editors really handles those caveats the best, or are there any, or does it really matter?
Before I hand it to the other dudes, I just want to say, like, we've referenced this in other episodes, and this is almost one of the biggest changes is that PowerSchool now more handily accepts and uses traditional web standards than it used to. And that's what makes it better. So I don't want to say it's a completely moot point, but like now that PowerSchool it's really when you're handling the PSHTML now, that's where things get, you don't know. But what do you guys think?
Yeah. So, the one of the weird things about doing PowerSchool development is that the server-side code and the client-side code are merged into one horrifying document. So, in most other environments where you're doing this work, you've got server-side stuff that creates client-side stuff, and those two things might meld a little bit, but at least the language is standard. So I've done a lot of PHP in my day, and at least like those editors, because those are widely used, those can toggle between those two things just as easily as you toggle between HTML and JavaScript in a plain client-side file. But no text editor is aware of PSHTML. None of them have any idea what that stuff is. So when you're like, oh, I'm going to beautify this document, and you hit in VS Code, it's Alt-Shift-F, you hit that, and you're like, oh, what has happened? This is this is now a mess. And like PSHTML is fantastic because it's so easy for people to do that, like dip down into the database layer and grab some stuff and surface it into a page that somebody's going to use. But really, no other language or environment makes that as easy as it is in PowerSchool. So it's fantastic. But man, you try to use an editor that has no idea what that is, it can be a disaster. It was part like SQL Studio writing the beautifier, and that was really tough because it was really angry at seeing things like cur stud ID and cur year ID, because it wants to like, oh, I know what that is. That's a variable in a parenthesis. Wait, what's this tilde? That doesn't belong here. You don't use tildes in SQL. What's going on?
Right.
So that's,
that's a pretty. You wrote a beautifier for SQL Studio?
There is one in there now. Yeah. I didn't really write it. It's a library that supports it, but like what I had to do to make it not die on PSHTML is crazy. What I do is I I split the whole document up into words. So every word, every entity in there is its own thing. And then the beautifier tries to beautify it. And then anything that got messed up when it went server side gets restored back to what it was when you had it in your editor. And then it smashes the whole document back together. Wow. It took months to figure out how to do. But now, yes, you can hit beautify and it'll make your query, look really good. It'll capitalize all the keywords and that kind of stuff. It's pretty nice.
Is that the format you're talking about?
Yeah, that's the format button. Okay. Yep.
Yeah, I noticed that and I appreciated that because I live on that when in Oracle straight up. And then, like I said, I was telling you I was using it the past couple of weeks SQL Studio. And it's just a nice thing to have in there. And now I don't have to make the extra step. So yeah, nice. Yeah,
really pushed the envelope on that and wanted it to work well with Scott Bestfodder, another one of your Canadian brethren. He got some of the beta versions and was like, yes. He's in the same province?
Oh yeah, man. We used to be in the before I was when I was still with divisions, we monthly we were meeting together.
Nice.
Yeah.
So he kept throwing code at it and I was like, oh, the beautifier destroyed it. Like this is cool, and he just kept but and I fixed all those things to make it go. Okay.
And by the way, Schmestfatter.
Schmott. Say it 3 times and maybe he'll show up in the next episode.
Apparently it's all it takes.
That's all it takes. So I was available. That's why I'm here. So let's get back to editors. So VS Code advocating for that. So we briefly talked about Git at the end of the last episode, but having something that manages your source code and keeps track of your changes for you is vitally important to maintaining any project. So I'm a plugin developer, but I also work full-time in a school, and our whole web root is in its own plugin. And so there's 2 of us that do this work, and the 2 of us are always updating pretty diligently a repository of code in Git that we share. And so we know when somebody else has made a change and what line and why, what version it was. And I encourage people when they take my source control management class at a PSUG, that's what I'm talking about. For anything that you're building, even if you're not building great big plugins like some of us do, it makes sense even for a web root. Go ahead and do it.
Yeah. So Adam, if you don't mind, for our listeners that aren't familiar with Git, can you give the elevator pitch of what Git is?
Yeah, I'd talk about it the same way I do in a class, which is the big advantages to using something to manage your source control. There's a couple options out there, but Git's the big one, is that it's a way for you to track when and why and how you made changes. I show a little cartoon in the class and I say, the worst developer is you 6 months ago.
That's my favorite Schmadam Schmarson quote ever.
I said something similar and must have referenced it from you in one of our earlier episodes. Then that's where I got it from.
Yep. That's where it comes from. It's from a Twitter account that I follow. It's awesome. I think about that all the time. And sometimes the interval can be shorter than that. It's you 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
I was up late doing that. I don't remember even writing this. That happens sometimes. Jeepers. So what Git does for you is it's sort of like when you play a video game and you have save points that you can go back to if you die. And there have been many times where I'm working on a feature and I die while doing it. And I need to come back and return to this previous save point and then make changes to it. It's a really important tool that once you manage a few projects or manage something for a long time, it's essential for what you do. And you can do it outside of your text editor. It's just nice having it all in the same tool.
Sure.
Does that cover Git well enough for now?
I think so.
Learn it. Do it.
I love this because you can go back to the save point. It's just reminded something you just said. It brought me this flashback to my days of when I was a server before I got into the nerd community.
You don't mean like a Linux server. You mean like a food server.
Yeah, I know. I brought people food.
Yeah.
I was a server.
I was a physical pizza box server.
I was Apache.
and this lady at the end of the day, she hands me the check, and she goes, "I do not leave a tip because the soup was cold. You do better next time."
Seinfeld. This just sounds like Seinfeld to me.
And that's it. You're like, I'm going to go back to this save point, but I didn't get to do that with this lady because she never came back.
Never came back.
Because her soup was cold, apparently.
Can't fix
But
this.
you do better next time. That's like you're like, I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna do better this time.
One of the things I like about it is that I can edit things with reckless abandon. So like if I'm testing, like I want to see if this idea is going to work, I can kind of branch down this way. And if it fails, I just roll back to that previous save point and
What's
then I
the
move
worst
forward.
that can happen?
Right. Yeah, it's huge.
In the most like that is way more efficient. But I mean, before you adopt Git, and I mean I was probably slower to adopt Git. You'd sit there and you'd save. I mean, this is referencing to PowerSchool plugins. You'd sit there and if you edited with your text editor and then you loaded the plugins each time, you just start naming the plugins sorry,
With
not
the version numbers.
Like, this one worked. This one didn't. This one did this, but didn't. So you start putting creative names on them and you load those versions into the
So
server.
again, I always go back to maybe I need to change the term, but you know our armchair developers that I feel like a lot of our listeners are, you know, maybe they're just looking at customizing one page. Is, you know, I already know the answer, but is Git viable for something like even a project that just on a single page? If we're, you know, even if it's just as simple as adding a new link to more to.
Once you understand Git, then it becomes that easy.
Yeah.
It really does, because it's all just a bunch of like, frankly, it's less clicks than creating new creating new files and everything like that. Like you just create your repo and then there you go. So it may seem before you're into it more, and I'm probably speaking more to the common armchair developer than any of you, I would feel. Then so once you figure those things out, then it just becomes, for a single file like that, way more easy and attainable, because every little change you make to that one page is now tracked and managed and noted, rather than, you know, sitting there literally, whether you're in Blue Steel, whether you're in CPM, or just throwing it out on your desktop. It's nice. Honestly, it's just a nice safety net to have.
Yeah, and honestly, the reason that I even bring it up is being in that situation, being in a district for 15 years, and working on those tiny little changes that I never always looked at Git as being like, oh, that's for the pros, that's for the high end developers, that's for someone that's way beyond me. You know, Git is almost like that, like, you know, someday I'll use that if I feel it being necessary. But now being in this role, in this position, and seeing how Git can be used, I wish I would have used it years ago.
And
yeah, it's huge.
If you've ever been in the position where you wrote some code, you wrote a page that, you know, was nearly there, and then you did a couple changes that got it even better, and then you did a couple changes that completely destroyed it.
There it is. Yep.
Git is for you.
Yep.
Because now you don't have to sit there and remember,
what did I change?
And you don't have to Control Z yourself to try to figure out what happened.
Yeah, for sure.
Know, you can just look at your repo and figure out what you published, what you pushed, and you know, it's such a, I don't know, stress saver, really.
Yeah.
And so if you're
getting back to Eric's point as well, you know, obviously this isn't an instruction on how to use Git. Plenty of YouTube videos, plenty of guides out there. If you have any development into PowerSchool, I think we would all strongly suggest you get into a repository. Get into Git, exactly.
So the best time to learn Git is 4 years ago. And the second best time.
Yeah.
The second best time is today. Like the sooner you get on it, the better.
It's like the same for
the worst motivational speech
I'm gonna get like the motivational posters in my office. Right? Adam Larsen.
Just hang them up.
If I may, I want to, and I know this might be a little abrupt. Hopefully, I feel like we've hit a good segue point. But a couple of the things that we've been talking about have brought me to what I think is a really important in the PowerSchool context. This or that. I wonder if we could all debate for a moment Tlist versus Power Query. And yeah, I know. I mean, I look at you both and you're like, I have opinions on that.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good one.
Because we talked about Tlist in the context of text editors and breaking things in text editors.
Yep.
We talked about how PowerSchool is moving to more traditional web standards, and that would be a Power Query. And I'll just say I have my reservations about using Power Queries, and I have the things that I love about Power Queries. And I want to ask our guest, you've talked a lot, you say you write Power Queries a lot. So why? And do you still write Tlist? Or, I mean, it is strongly deprecated. So what's your take on Tlist versus Power Query? I'm just going to leave it at that and see what you have to say.
So the reason I use one or the other, it depends on context entirely.
You
and I'm
mean
fluent
this or that?
this or that. The reason I would use this one or that one is because of context. So there are certain things that one or the other cannot do, and there are certain things that one does far better than the other. So let's talk about Tlist SQL, first of all, what it is and why we use it. So it's a tag that we use in PSHTML to dip down into the database level and then surface data into the client-side code level. So you can dump that into HTML, you can jump it into JavaScript.
I got to say, that is a very nice way to put it. But keep going.
Well,
That's what it does. Like, you don't have to know any passwords. You don't have to create a connection over ODBC. Like, it is a tag for dipping to that level in the stack of things that is a PowerSchool server. Grab the data and then dump it into here. I use it for anything that's internal. So if I'm building any plugin that, even if it's going to dump like JSON data in, that's going to be consumed by Angular or for jQuery, I'm going to use a Tlist SQL tag to do that. There's a couple of reasons. One is it just works. It is always going to work, except in the rare case that I'm going to have more than 50,000 records that come out.
Yep.
There it is.
Because that is death to Tlist SQL. I actually have, it just came up a couple weeks ago. I got a really big school that had online report cards built. And if you multiply all the kids by the terms, by the courses and the standards, it's very easily more than 50,000 data points. Okay, well, that's what you have to do.
The gentleman we were talking about before this, that big district, the same thing. Exactly why I had to go through a Power Query.
Yeah, so we'll shift to that, which is fine. I don't use them for plugins that I am building because of what I consider to be a bug in the framework, which is that you cannot write a Power Query against schema that is built in the same plugin. The way that plugins install is out of order with each other. There's just a little hang up in there.
Yes.
And you can't, it's not the Power Query itself, it's that you can't create schema and then authorize the touching of the schema either through read-only or write abilities, because plugin XML is loaded before the schema definition is loaded. Those steps are just out of sequence.
Yep.
It's been there as long as plugins and extended schema have been a thing, and we just have to work around it. So we either build two plugins or we do a Tlist SQL. When I use Power Queries is one of two cases. One is they're great for creating things that somebody can run themselves in DEM. So if you're building some...
Sorry, what's DEM?
Data Export Manager. Thank you for...
Is that, I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt, but is that, everybody knows what DDE is, but does everybody know what DEM is yet? I don't know.
We should talk about it. So it's
anyway,
it's the
DEM, Data Export Manager. That's why you like to write Power Queries sometimes.
It's like DDE on steroids, or quick export on steroids. You know, it has the ability to. Well, but it doesn't. Well, yeah, and it can change stuff. So it is DDA on steroids too. So DEM, Data Export Manager, is fantastic because you can like synthesize data sets together, and there's Power Queries that exist in the core. But like, if I want to write a Power Query that somebody is going to run at will, it's nice because I can write this Power Query. It links all the tables together and has the data as they want it, and then they, whenever they want to, can run that. They also can schedule it to SFTP it to, a vendor or something, right? So that's
and filter it, right?
And filter it and sort it and rename the headers. Like, it's an amazing tool. I wish it could hit more of the tables stock, but it just doesn't. You use quick export for certain things, DDE for certain things, DEM for others.
on this topic, we need to also throw in enterprise reports.
We do, but I don't use it.
I don't know enough at all to speak to it. I've used it. I couldn't even speak a lick to it, though, honestly, at this point.
So, like, unfortunately, there's not going to be much of a conversation about it then. But I feel like that was kind of one of the reasons that enterprise reports was created, is for your administrators to be able to create these SQL reports using enterprise reports instead of using Power Query.
I don't want to switch
because
off
it's still going to have the same those same pieces of building it to allow the user to run it. The other extra piece that enterprise reports is going to give you is now you also have, if you're including extra columns or fields, they have those available. The filtering, all of that is also inside of enterprise reports. Possibly to some people's opinion, maybe a little bit prettier than running Power Query within Data Export Manager.
Well, can we? I don't know. Like, let's see what we all think here. Can we pause the enterprise reports introduction, just because I feel that's more of an object reports versus enterprise reports, and maybe you'll all disagree with me, and I don't want to stifle Adam's thought process here. I feel like
I have one more thought on PQs too. I want to hit. So that's a good spot to pause, because like at ER is its own whole discussion, like how we build reports is its own.
Sure. Oh God, we could have an episode around Tlist versus Power Query versus Apex and Enterprise for sure.
So the final thought I want to share on PQs is that if you want external access over the API to any
is that
data,
what the cool kids call it?
That is what the cool kids call it. PQs.
It's the abbreviation I use in my plugins when I'm doing
apparently I need to start
now.
PQs
hip in the PQ lingo. So a Power Query is a bit of SQL. It is a bit of structured query language that you are able to write with a plugin, install it to a server, and then
structured query language.
SQL. That's the language of databases that performs all the create, read, update, delete functions of a database. That's the way you interface with the database. So whether you're writing it in SQL Studio or SQL Developer or Navicat or anything you're using, even Tlist SQL, that's all using SQL. All right, let's just keep reducing this down to you see on the hard drive, there are ones and zeros that are moved by a magnet.
Well, just say you could tell you are the one with an education background here.
So when you install a Power Query, one of the things that happens is PowerSchool creates an endpoint on their API, the application programming interface, that allows you to, whenever you want to, say, I want that data called that thing. And PowerSchool will return to you an entity, a block of data that is organized in the way that query was laid out. Now I have an entire product that is built, my early warning system is built on the ability to pull data out over the API, do some analytics with it, and then give it back to you in a layer that you can consume it, that you can use it. I write Power Queries all day. My entire implementation is, what data do you want? I'll write a Power Query for you. I will install it for you. I turn the machine on. It does its thing. So that's when they're indicated. They all have a purpose. I don't find Power Queries, as much as I write them, to be compelling enough of a use case that I want to use them internally in a PowerSchool plugin, unless I'm going to hit 50,000 rows. That's literally the only time that I would pivot to going over and using Power Queries. That's my opinion.
So I love what you just said, and I want to point this out because I gotta be completely honest. I'm not a huge fan of Power Queries for a few different reasons. But if you balance out the pros and cons, what you just said about them being an API endpoint, and I don't think a lot of people know that or maybe even quite understand what that means. But when you create a Power Query, you're creating an API endpoint. And that means that resource, that data, can be consumed within a custom page, within Data Export Manager, and from an external system if the permissions are provided appropriately. So the Power Queries, one of the great things about them, though I have things that I'm not as happy about, is that they're extremely flexible and accessible via different routes, if you will.
Avenues.
Yeah, totally. And they're vital for interacting with vendors. Me acting as a vendor, it's fantastic. But as a school district employee, I had this conversation with my guys just this morning. We got to provide this kind of data out to this vendor. They don't really have any automated way of doing it. We'll just write a Power Query and we'll schedule it in DEM to shove that data out to their SFTP server. That's how they consume the data.
Isn't that what AutoSend is for? I'm actually serious because I think somebody's thinking this right now, and like, isn't that what AutoSend is for?
Well, I can key in here a little bit. One of the big benefits to using DEM and scheduled exports is leveraging the remote connections manager. So if any of your users want to look at your plugin management console, one thing that you're going to see down there at the R's is remote connection manager, right? And if you have any third-party applications that you're sending data to, more than likely you're going to see something of that in there. And when using Data Export Manager, it's literally just choosing in a drop-down box of which connection that you're using to do that. And a lot of those do use SFTP. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, that's not an option in AutoSend, is it?
I think you can.
Am I wrong? If I'm wrong,
I couldn't tell you. I haven't used it in way too long to.
The more important
disagree with you, but I will not adamantly disagree with you.
The more important part is what I think Eric was alluding to. Like, he asked that question intentionally, and now I know what he was doing. So the idea here is that yes, AutoSend is great if you're sending very simple files and they don't need any filtering done. So like AutoSend, you can send data from the students table, from the staff table. But if you only want to get students in a certain grade level or in a certain building, well, you can't. You can do buildings if you did it at the school level, as a context. But if you're going to do an AutoSend where you
I only want my special ed kids, Adam.
Yeah, exactly. Only that kind of a filter. There's no way. So you're going to use DEM. If you use a stock, one of the core data sets, cool. Otherwise, you can write a Power Query and build the filtering right into it. That's the only way to have those complex choices made.
Good. Yes, because that is the biggest, I think, shortcoming of them is that it allows you to enter them when you're running them manually, but you can't do anything with them if you're running them on an automated basis. You can't pass in those arguments.
On a data export manager?
Yeah.
He's talking about the scheduled exports.
Yes. When you create a template that applies the filter when you send it up. So if you only wanted the IEP'd kids, as long as you pull it back as a field, you'll create a template and say, give me only the kids where this is equal to 1. You save it as a template, then you schedule that template. It will apply that filter every time.
Are you saying if you build it into the Power Query or you build it try to put in an argument? I will admit that possibly I'm remembering things wrong here. So just so that I'm not talking out my rear. But I found passing in the arguments dynamic. When you're in the DEM and you have the option to pass in those arguments, the ones that I found that anytime I've tried to schedule those with any dynamic inputs, and I haven't done it long enough to remember, but all I get is an error with 0 results.
When you say dynamic, do you mean you want to put in Cur school ID, or you want to say grade level equals 3?
Something like that.
I don't know that PSHTML works there. I think that you're asking for problems.
And I'm not sure if I mean specifically Cur school ID, but let's just say something along the lines of that.
Well, that one doesn't even because you're running it without context anyway. But I'm not sure without testing it empirically. That's just one where I won't say either way because I don't know what's going to happen.
That could go on for a while. But Adam, I think you picked up the reason I intentionally asked that question to you is to demonstrate, there's so much more that you can do with a Power Query and Data Export Manager that we could not have achieved in the days when we only had AutoSend. So,
and a lot of tools that come out of PowerSchool, when AutoSend was a thing, when it was new, the only thing they ever wanted to do was send up just regular student data, just a flat thing of student data. Well, our needs have become more complex because that's, we don't live in that day today. You got to set up rosters of the stuff the kids are enrolled in, or I got to send discipline records or credits to some vendor. And the only way to do that is if you open it up. But there's trade-offs, right? That should be a theme what we're doing here. So AutoSend, can do simple things, but really anybody who knows the schema, the student field schema, can build it. Power queries can really export anything that is not prevented from being used, but it takes know-how to do it. You've got to be able to write SQL. Not everyone should know how to write SQL because it's not everybody's job, but like when you need the complex data set, you got to have the right tool for the job. And so
not just SQL, right? A Power Query goes deeper than SQL. And I think that gets back to the debate of Tlist versus Power Queries.
Yeah.
I've always said, if you know SQL, I can get you to Tlist in 15 minutes.
Right.
Yeah, but Power Queries, right, because you got to wrap that whole bugger in XML.
Yes.
You've got to like do the plugin framework. Right. So it's not just knowing the language, it's knowing like the ecosystem in which you build it.
I like that better when you're saying the ecosystem, because it goes beyond XML and SQL. It is actually, there are ways to write the SQL that work in the Power Query.
So for our listeners, if they want to get into writing Power Queries, where would we send them?
So
I got a couple things.
It's kind of a running theme that I want to provide
find
resources, right? I want to provide resources to our listeners.
The developer site, sure, that is your best option, but really, I don't know. You got to find a well-written Power Query to get a good example, because I don't want to poop on anything here, but like there's not the greatest examples of a complex,
So can I throw out a couple suggestions? Because I have two that
please.
come to the forefront of my mind. When you say, I've never written a Power Query, I want to learn how. And one thing we never want to do is try to sell anything or promote anything, but I want to talk about two resources that are out there. So one is a free plugin available by us. It is the customization reference plugin available on the MBA website. There is a tab in that reference that refers to Power Query development. And there are examples in there. I think that's a great place to start. As Brian alluded to, there's information out on PowerSchool's developer site as well. Also in SQL
great
Studio.
resource overall.
Yeah.
By the way, I just want to throw out there, it is a solid resource, but there are shortcomings with everything. But anyway, sorry.
Also in SQL Studio, which written by someone who happens to be participating in this conversation right now, available, I believe, right? AuroraEdTech.com. Adam.
Yeah. Yep. AuroraEdTech.com. You got it.
We'll provide a link to that in the episode. But so Adam, you have a free version of SQL Studio and a paid version of SQL Studio. The free version, you can write your queries, you can execute them against the database, you can get that information back directly within the browser without needing to establish VPN or ODBC or anything like that. But I think in the paid version, there is a great feature that actually allows you to take your Power Query, and you've embedded code that will convert that into your query that you've just typed into the SQL editor into a Power Query. So just a little shout out to our guest here. Again, not trying to shamelessly plug anything, but I think it's a valid response to, if I don't know this, then how do I learn it? So, yeah,
For sure.
I think that's a good tool for making a Power Query happen.
All right, guys. Yep. I think that's a good place to wrap up. A lot of good points made today. When we talk about this or that, did we really make sure that, you're going to be using this versus that? I think it really comes down to a lot of personal preference and, learning to use the tools that are available to you. So make your own.
Eric's point earlier was fantastic. I want to come back to that. He said, whatever tool you're using, make sure that you know what it's able to do, the keystrokes are, what its features are. But to even put a finer points on it, the best tool is the one that you can use.
Yes.
So like you're not going to shame anybody's text editor, right? Like if you're using it to its fullest potential, then fine. Like we never discussed jQuery versus Angular or any of those kinds of things. Like, use what tools you have available to you, whatever language it is and whatever software piece you have. If you're using it and you're making cool stuff, you're winning. You're already better than most other people because they don't even try. Just try. Just make a thing and do it.
Absolutely.
Adam, can you come back with us someday and do part 3 of this episode of jQuery versus Angular? Because I think you have opinions about that I'd love to hear.
I have opinions, and I'll fight to the death to defend them.
Adam Larsen will return.
Perfect.
But for now, we leave it at this. And next time on an all new Sumbits, we head to the Middle East and speak with the queen of PowerSchool customizations, Rami Bacchus.
Looking forward to it, Rami. Adam, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. Hopefully we can get you back on the podcast sometime soon. We'll definitely figure out lots of ways to get you back on here. Till next time, everybody. Take care. Enjoy your PowerSchool customizations. Have a good one.
Thanks for joining us, and a special thanks to our subscribers. Consider becoming one today. Enjoy more episodes and learn more at mba-link.com.